Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to A Wild Vision. And tonight we're going to be talking about one of my favourite subjects, the common toad. And I have Emily Millhouse from Froglife all lined up, and we'll get talking toads right after this. Well, welcome back. And I've got Emily all lined up, and she's waiting in the wings to come on and chat toads with us. But before we get into that, I just wanted to catch up with some of you who have been entering the Wild Art Photographer of the Year competition, just with a couple of little bits of news. There is a dedicated news video which I put up on the YouTube channel, which you'll see. So if you want to see the news, the sort of latest in a little bit more detail, then do click on that and have a watch. But just a quick reminder that our latest category, light, is going to be closing on Monday evening at 12 midnight. So that's London time. So if you're in a different time zone, don't get that muddled up because the system will cut off. So if you want to enter that category, make sure you get your entries in nice and early. Do it over the weekend if you can. It'll give me time to sort out any problems you've got. Talking of the weekend, on Saturday, I'll be releasing the top 100 list for wet. So do look out for that. I'll send everybody an email, but that'll come out on Saturday. So if you entered that contest, do check that out and see whether you're on the list. Finally, I'd just like to say a huge thank you to everybody who's sent such lovely messages to me on social media and via direct email about the book, which a lot of you have been receiving over the last few days. It really means a lot to me, to get that sort of feedback. And I get quite emotional about it at the time, but at times. So thank you all for that. That's it's really appreciated. And of course, if you haven't bought your copy, I'll just brandish a copy. Head on over to the website and go and order that up, because basically before the end of May, if you order it before the end of May, then £5 of every purchase does go to the conservation causes that we supported in last year's competition, which does include Froglife, of course, which Victoria Hillman supported through her category abstracts. So thank you all for that. So without much further ado, or any further ado, let me introduce Emily Millhouse to you. So let me add her into the stream. Good evening, Emily, and welcome to A Wild Vision.
Oh, thank you very much, Rob. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. And we're going to talk about one of my favorite subjects, and yours as well.
Yep.
And that's the common toad. So why don't you introduce yourself, give people a bit of background about you and your work, and how you got involved with Froglife, and how your interest in toads and other amphibians developed.
Yeah, of course. So I've been with Froglife now for about 6 years, and previous to that, I used to actually work as a warden on a 4-acre wetland where we didn't actually have any toads. We did previously, but it was in a very urban area of London that essentially the population there had just struggled so much so that we just stopped finding them. But I was still very keen on both being around ponds as habitats, and we had a lot of smooth newts on site, so the amphibians were still there.
Yeah.
And then I joined Froglife to sort of have a slight change, really, from being based on one site to getting the opportunity to go out and visit many different places and build many different ponds and speak to people a little bit more about this group of sort of amphibians and reptiles and bring them a bit to the forefront of people's minds. People tend to think a lot about animals that are flying or animals that are fluffy, and not so often about this wonderful group. So that was kind of my pathway in, and I feel very, very lucky that I get to spend most of my days telling people how wonderful these animals are, and particularly the common toad, which has been the species I've been focused on for the past 3.5 years.
Yeah, because it's in serious trouble, isn't it, the common toad?
It is, and I know you've mentioned it before in one of your previous videos about we have lost 68% of our common toad populations in the UK, and that's just over the sort of past 30-year period, and a huge factor in that has been loss of habitat, so lots of ponds being drained, or quite a big shift actually towards tidy gardening, in that people removing these ponds. And a big factor, which I know actually a few people tonight joining us will be aware of, is of course their mortality on roads, which they just sort of struggle to cross when migrating back to their ponds.
Yeah, exactly. I tell you what I'm going to do is I'm going to just share a picture with everybody. So as we go through the talk, I thought I'd just share a few pictures. We'll start with this one, which is an amplexus pair sat on the road. So these are common toads for people that don't know and are joining. And of course, this is for me and some of the toad patrollers who may be watching. This is a common sight. Particularly as we get sort of later into the season. So basically, a lot of people think that toads and frogs spend their lives in ponds, but they don't, do they? The majority of them.
No, they really don't.
Yeah.
It's quite a small proportion of the year they do spend there.
Yeah. So, I mean, basically what happens is that, they're a terrestrial animal in the main. And in the early spring, around this time of the year, they migrate to the ponds to breed, and of course it's that migration that brings them into contact with roads and gets them into all sorts of trouble, because they're not the fastest of animals, of course. So this is where a lot of Froglife coordinate this toad patrol operation across the country, don't they? I mean, how many crossings have you got? Do you know off the top of your head?
Yeah, so I know our peak was 210 crossings that we have, but in general we get about 180 crossings sending data each year through to us. So yeah, quite a few keen groups of volunteers that are wonderful that go out to help them.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to say, actually, if anybody's watching and they want to ask Emily or me a question, then please do pop that in the chat. And if you want to just drop by and say hello, then please do that, and I'll give you a mention. If somebody wants to make a comment, actually, I just want to make sure those comments work as well. That'd be appreciated. So I mean, 180 odd crossings that supply data. What would you say on average, the numbers are for those crossings? I mean, I guess they vary greatly, don't they, depending on where they are and
they do,
and how many people are helping.
Exactly that. Some of our smaller patrols may only be moving sort of a few hundred over sort of the whole season. So there's a couple, particularly in very urban areas, that don't quite get the huge numbers that you may see on other sites. So probably it's ranging generally between 1.5 to sort of 2,000-3,000 toads on patrols. But then there are some that move sort of upwards of sort of 10,000-12,000 if they've got a very, very active site.
You're kidding me.
Yeah, very much fulfilling that collective noun of an army of toads when you're looking at that many crossing.
Absolutely. I mean, and how much of an effect do you actually think that the road has had on the population when you compare it to habitat loss? I mean, it's a very difficult statistic to try and tease out, I guess, but is there any data that might support an idea on that?
Yeah, so one thing is, of course, as toad patrollers, you also record the amount of deaths on those roads.
Yes, we do. Yeah.
Specifically on those patrols, we probably see about 11% of all toad sort of sightings on those roads are actually dead toads. So it's quite significant, and that's of course just in these monitored areas. There could be plenty other patrols or areas that maybe would require a patrol where toads are crossing, where they're still having quite a higher mortality rate. I mean, with the ponds themselves, it's a harder thing to quantify there, but a big issue with them is toads tending or trying their best to get back to their maternal pond, the pond that they grew up in. If those ponds, the conditions of those ponds, if they haven't been managed that well, as they start to drop off, then your toads start to struggle even more so. And I think that's as we find sort of funding cuts within landowners that have these ponds, if those ponds are trying their best with succession, every pond's dream, I always say, is to become a woodland. If it's getting towards that phase, of course, our amphibians, particularly the toads here, they've not got that space to breed, and it's already hard enough for them, which is unlike actually our common frogs, in that being a species that prefers more temporary pools of water, they're quite happy and they're quite easy to change that up. So you'll find them more readily, even sometimes in questionable spaces. You could have built a lovely wildlife pond in your back garden, and then maybe on your driveway there's a puddle, and that's been chosen.
I've had them in the local wood here, where they go into vehicle ruts, and then they
Yeah.
spawn in those when they're filled with water over the sort of early part of the spring and late winter. And then, of course, as that spawn's developing, those ruts are drying out. It just happened to me last year. It's terrible to watch it, but there's nothing you can do when an animal has chosen not the best place, to actually spawn. But that's one of those really interesting facts about common toads that I find fascinating, is there's this desire and this drive to get back to the pond they were spawned in, basically. And they always look, which is why those populations build up, and they're very loyal to those sites, aren't they? Whereas frogs are a bit more, as you say, a bit more transient in that respect. But no, it's they're just a fascinating animal. And it's interesting to hear you say that statistic about 10% or 11% of mortality, because that is what we get at the crossing in Hampshire. And
Right.
I think we were saying before we came on that the first year that we did it, we had something like 3,500 animals that we collected live. I forget what the deaths were, but I think it was about 10%. So, and that's generally what we get, on the sheets as we're doing them every night. I look at the percentage, and of course 10% is quite easy to work out, even for my simple brain. And it does tend to be about that, work out about that on average. I mean, I always like a night where you pick up a few animals and you don't get any that are killed. I always think that's a really successful night.
It's heroes work, that.
Yeah. It's amazing how people can develop, and where you knit communities together, and people develop this affection for the toad. Because I mean, you were going to talk a little bit about the folklore of the toad, weren't we? You sort of mentioned that to me before we came on air, and because people's perception of this animal isn't actually what it's like. They think that they're slimy, and they think they're going to catch something from them, or they're, are there any sort of interesting folklore stories surrounding those sorts of things?
There are. So, I mean, common toads as a sort of species group have been around for around 3 million years. So they've been here very much as long as us, for our entire existence. And I know very much so in medieval times, that kind of mass movement of amphibians, almost a swarm, like a swarm of locusts, people used to associate maybe with death or problems or big catastrophic sort of events occurring. So I think there was certainly an early worry about this massive plague of these animals moving towards pools of water, which also in many periods of time they wouldn't have been in great condition. Maybe there were large stagnant pools of water, and again people were very cautious about disease in that kind of space. And although the common toad here, I'm sure no one would want to eat, but where it does produce a toxin, people also were very worried about it carrying diseases that would spread to people. So there already became that quite negative view around them, and obviously the way that they look. Although I think the photos you've got up there, I think it's two incredibly handsome animals we're looking at, very sweet. I can understand that it's very different to us, and their sort of whole metamorphosis of different life stages, again very different to us, which now we understand that's normal for an amphibian to go through that sort of the long strings of spawn all the way through to the tadpoles and up. But that's quite a big change for maybe people that didn't have the understanding of what was occurring there. And I mean,
that's an interesting point you make, actually, about just sort of focusing on the word spawn that you used, is that the toad spawn is very, very different to frog spawn, for those that don't know. And the toad spawn is sort of long strings of eggs, as opposed to those sort of great big groups of sort of the way people traditionally think about frog spawn. So it's very easy to tell it apart, and actually it's a little bit more difficult to see, I find, because they wrap it around vegetation, don't they? And it's a bit more hidden than the obvious frog spawn, but it's a very, very very different. It's very easy to tell them apart.
And there's also benefits in the way that they're doing that, as opposed to sort of the sheer numbers of frog spawn you'll find sort of clumped up on the surface. There's many other predators within those ponds that will consume that, whereas the toads will lay slightly less deeper, and that's another key reason why they're so rigid in what ponds they're looking for. the tadpoles of the two different animals, the frogs and toads, they develop slightly differently. That frog tadpoles can develop at a quicker rate if it's slightly warmer, and so if the water becomes shallower and shallower, they can speed up that metamorphosis, whereas toads can't. So they've got less, or I should actually say they've got more risk really in if they lay their spawn in an appropriate pond, that spawn won't develop all the way up to toadlet. So yeah, a little bit harder for us to spot when we want to go out there and find it, but they're thinking it through.
So they're more exacting with their with their requirements when it comes to ponds. Yeah, no, I mean it's I've always sort of tended to find actually that the deeper ponds are the ones that the toads will prefer. As you say, you get some frog spawn in some very surprising places. Wheel ruts are an absolute classic for that. In a woodland, and it's a shame. Yeah. Because a lot of it is lost. I mean, we put a pond in the garden about this time last year, actually, only a small scrape basically, because I didn't want too. I mean, it's certainly not a fish pond; it's a wildlife pond, and it's amazing how quickly wildlife finds that from a rubber lining, basically. For me, throwing in a few, I bought some sort of native water plants. And put them in, and they grew really quickly, actually. And so from this time last year, by sort of May, I had damselflies egg laying in it. It was incredible. I think I had 4 species of damselfly and 4 species of dragonfly, which I spotted, all egg laying, including emperor, which was really lovely to see.
Well, it's such value adding water, even outside, as you're saying there, even outside of the amphibians. So many things will use that.
Well, I just think it's kind of as important as, I mean, the tow patrol is an important thing, particularly on these sort of busy crossings, because I just think that's sort of conservation in action. It's proactive conservation. It's conservation that doesn't cost much money. I mean, it's a high-vis jacket, it's a torch, and it's a bit of organization and people's time. So that's something you can do immediately, and a pond is something that happens almost instantly as well, and it's important, I think, if people are thinking about rewilding parts of the garden, as I've done, in our garden, I think a body of water, no matter how small it is, because I've seen people with urban gardens using old sort of ice cream tubs or washing up bowls and things like that, and creating small ponds that way, and the amount of life that finds that so quickly, including dragonflies, is absolutely incredible. I mean, it's one of the most important things, one of the most important elements I think you can add, to if you're thinking of rewilding. And I'm really hoping I get frogs. I really hope it, or toad. I don't mind, but I think it's too shallow for toads. I think it's a frog pond. And we get them out on the patio. When we had them out there the other night, my dog found them, started barking at them. We had both toads and frogs actually on the patio when it was really wet the other night. So I've got my fingers crossed.
Well, I wish you luck with that. I mean, it won't be long if it's there.
No,
they'll certainly visit even through the summer if it gets if we get a very warm and dry snap. They'll be visiting these watery bodies to cool off.
Well, I've got my fingers crossed. I keep looking at it. We were talking about, obviously, I mentioned Victoria Hillman earlier, who was in charge of the wild art category that we supported Froglife with last year, abstracts. And I was talking to her this afternoon, and she's got a pond in her garden, and she said it's absolutely rammed with frog spawn. I said, well, I haven't seen any yet. I haven't seen any frog spawn yet, but she said absolutely rammed with it. So yeah, it won't take long. I reckon maybe might not be this year, it might be next year, but let's hope so. It'd be lovely to see that in the garden, definitely. That's for sure. Definitely
would. And I mean, that mantra very much is true of you build it and they will come. It'll take them a little bit of time, but they will make it. And even for the area that I tend to work in, which is sort of a very heavily urbanized London, they still make it, and particularly newts here. They'll use sort of smelling really to find biochemical cues from ponds to navigate towards them. So they will get there.
do you think is that true of all amphibians, that it's that sense of smell that they use to find these water bodies?
So smell is a big factor that a lot of them use. There's other things. I mean, the palmate newt probably wins when it comes to basically being a compass of an animal. That taps into the Earth's sort of geomagnetic sort of rings, really, to navigate back. So you can move them like about 50 kilometers away from their ponds, and they're very likely to make it straight back. They know where they're heading.
Wow, 50 Ks.
50
I mean, for people who don't know, I mean, these things are what sort of?
Oh yeah, that's 6 centimeters.
Yeah, 2 inches long.
Yeah,
I mean, they're so difficult to spot on the road as well, and that's the problem. You know, we often miss them because they're just so, particularly when it's absolutely chucking it down with rain, and they're so difficult to spot. But we do get them, and we get smooth newts and great crested as well. In fact, you know, we've picked up a few. We had about half a dozen great cresteds last year, if I remember rightly. So, and that's a fantastic animal.
It is, and toads are very important for them, because talking about finding ponds, more so than frogs, but we find the newts, particularly actually palmate newts and great crested, will basically listen out for toad calling. So when they hear toads calling, they then hone in towards those ponds. So if they've grown up in the same ponds together, they'll use the toads being very vocal to make their way back directly to the pond. So they're doing a service to other animals as well as themselves.
Well, as you sort of mentioning sort of vocalizations, this is one of the things that for people who joined the toad patrol in the village and obviously had seen toads before but didn't really know too much about the animals. One of the things they all said to me when we started collecting numbers of them, because obviously the males start chirping and they've got this lovely sound, is that they all fell in love with that. They all found that just so endearing. And in fact, you know, I did sort of record a few little clips of video on my phone. Why don't we just? I played this to you earlier before we came on air. Why don't we just play that, because it shows a common toad and it shows a frog, and it shows an amplexus pair, and part of that is this male is chirping away, and for people who haven't heard it. It's a very sweet sound. So let me just play that quickly for people, just out of interest, and so they can hear what these things sound like. So bear with me for about 30 seconds long. So yeah. So that's a toad. It's a male. It's the males that sing. You can probably hear them croaking away. So that's the frog. You can see the difference between a frog and a toad. This is going to be lively. It's just about to jump, but beautiful animal. So you can see how the males sort of clasp onto the females. That wasn't what's called an amplexus pair when I collected them, but this male's taken the opportunity to pair up. So you could hear the male chirping away in the background, and that's what that's one of the signals, is it, for for other species?
Yes. So if they live in those same ponds together, particularly great crested newts will often follow toad calls to find that exact pond. I mean, the toads aren't necessarily broadcasting it for the great crested newts.
No, of course, yeah.
They're using their signals to size each other up and decide, is it worth fighting this male off for that female? It's their first point of call, but it's very useful for many other animals. And actually, natterjack toads, the females almost entirely rely on the males making a lot of noise to find their ponds. So quite often they're going purely by what they can hear. So they'll go to essentially the loudest ponds is where you'll find more breeding pairs of natterjack toads.
Well, no, I haven't seen a natterjack for years. Saw them in Norfolk once, but haven't seen them for ages. Well, I thought I'd include a picture of a common frog, just to show people how different they are. When you first start, and particularly when we sort of first started Toad Patrol, a few people were, it's sort of quite difficult sometimes to tell them apart immediately. But the more you see both animals, the more obvious the differences are. And actually, it's the behavior for me more than anything, which is so obvious, because when you've been doing it for a while and you've been picking up a lot of these animals from the road, they sit on the road differently, they behave differently, they move differently. Frogs are a lot more lively than toads, and actually fewer of them get squashed as a result, because they get across the road quicker. Toads are quite lethargic, aren't they, in terms of their movements? They're very, very slow, and they'll just sit there and they'll just get, even when a car's coming at them, they just sit there and get run over. It's horrible to watch. But frogs generally are livelier, and they sit lower on the road, I always think. And you need a higher sided bucket with a frog. Because they escape. Yeah, practical. Well, my toad patrollers have worked that out. Because they're about. I had a frog in here. Oh, where's it gone? I said, well, it jumped out, because they do. In fact, I'll tell you a funny story which happened to me last week. But you know how it's been really windy recently. I think most people know this. I basically, on a couple of those nights, I've had to put the buckets in the back of the car to stop them getting blown over, because we picked up so many. You have to go back and get a new bucket, otherwise the poor toads at the bottom of the bucket are getting squashed if you collect too many. So I have a stack of buckets in the back of the car, so I put them in the back of the car so they didn't blow over. And of course I had collected a few frogs, but they were in the higher sided buckets anyway. Having sort of deposited them all in the pond and not thought anything more of it, I had to go into town the other day and go to the post office. And as I was driving along, I had the dog in the back. And as I was driving along, I felt something brush my leg. And I thought, it felt like something had dropped out of my pocket and landed on the, in the footwell. And I thought, I didn't think anything of it. So I went to the post office, posted whatever I needed to post, got back into the car, and I drove off, and I felt this thing just go thump, land on my leg. I looked down, it was a frog. It obviously escaped the bucket and had been spending its time in my car, and it basically ended up on my shoulder. And then I thought, well, I've got buckets in the bag, I can stop and put it in the bucket in a minute, put it on the passenger seat. Of course, then it jumped off, and it managed to get itself in the metal rail where the seat slides backwards and forwards, and all I could see were these 2 feet poking out of the end of it. So I had to stop and tease this thing out. I didn't hurt it, it was fine, but
certainly a new definition of toads on roads if the animals are in the vehicles.
In the vehicle itself. So watch out, kids. The toads are the frogs in particular are great escapologists. Oh dear. Right, what have what photo have I got next? Oh yeah, this is my friend Michael. So this is effectively what our toad patrollers do. We just go up and down the roads with torches, dodging the traffic and just trying to pick these animals up and stop them being squashed. And how many animals we save, it's difficult to say, because a lot of those animals obviously that we pick up would have made it across the road anyway. But I have a feeling that we have a significant impact, because there's certainly not the carnage left in the morning that there have been in the past. Because it's mild and wet nights, isn't it? That they use to navigate to their ponds. And as far as the sort of season goes in terms of the time, I guess that sort of depends very much on latitude. And I guess Scotland, for example, would be later than the south of England where I am. But what's that sort of season generally?
So generally our first reports of toads starting to move as sort of big groups, not the very keen males. Every so often you'll get some that have moved way earlier than the others.
Yeah.
You're looking at sort of early February for those right down in Cornwall. They're the first to kind of move. And actually a good example is for us in London, some of our patrols here, we don't really expect our toads moving until about the first or second week of March. So that's when we expect them to hit us. And then as you go more north in the country, they start to catch up with that. But you're right, wet sort of mild nights is what they're looking for. And they will move in waves as well. So if you have a real cold snap, I know our weather's been somewhat crazy in the past week or so. But if it isn't favourable, they will wait. And then maybe it will pulse again the next week, or in 2 weeks' time, they'll again start to continue that journey.
Yeah, that's what we've found here. But sometimes we've been picking them up in early February here. Because we I sort of tease people into it and get the patrollers ready, and we go out for a couple of nights perhaps just to let the traffic know that we're around again, and remind people that to drive carefully. And you might, as you say, it's generally because it's the males that move initially, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then the females follow on behind. But quite often they will pair up as well on the road,
Mhm.
which and of course the male is doing nothing and the female's doing all the work.
Yep, makes it even harder across
It
carrying
makes it
another.
even harder. Yeah. Emily, you were telling me about talking about the sort of difficulties that toads face. You were telling me about this project you've been working on, and this sort of tell everybody about the about the experience of being a toad that
Yes.
you've been organising, because I found this fascinating, and I'm dying to have a go actually.
So a few years ago, to try and encourage people that maybe wouldn't think a lot about toads and the struggles they have, we thought we'd develop something technology based. So we have a virtual reality experience where you essentially step into a toad's world. You become the same size as a toad. You put a headset on, and you join their migration. So you leave where you've been hibernating, spending your winter, and you're trying to get back to that pond. And the first thing you basically hit when you're on that walk is being the size of a toad as you hit something like a massive tarmac road, and you see the size of the vehicles and how tough that would be. Now, of course, to make it friendly, you're not one of those 10-11% that have been squashed, but you see the difficulties there, and then you get given an alternative route under the road using a wildlife tunnel, which is something we do quite a lot of research into, actually all across Europe with a few different partners, into them being a very reasonable mitigation step to stop some of these high rates of mortality, because we know where they're crossing. As you've said, every year you're going to the same area to get them, whereas actually, if you know there's always going to be toads moving there, you can completely help them by channeling them under the road to continue their journey on the other side. So that's what you become in there. So you see through their eyes, and it's certainly an experience. And at the end, I won't give it away for anyone if you're going to get a chance to visit any of our project teams that run this virtual reality, but you get a little surprise when you do get to the pond.
No, I think that's because we're in the village that we've got. There's a curb, which so the toads will cross the road and then they hit this curb, which is about 4 inches high, I suppose. And for your average toad, that's quite a barrier. So they then channel, they wander up and down this curb looking for gaps, or places they can crawl up and get on top of it, because behind that then is a ditch, which I think a lot of them use as a navigation route into the pond. They go up and down this ditch, but of course a lot of them have got to cross this road before they can get into it. So you don't realize how much of a problem this is, and how many barriers we put in their way, because roads in them by themselves, because I've written about this before, and I guess some of the people that are watching this may well have read a couple of those articles. It was about how we basically have fragmented the habitat, not just for toads but for all sorts of things. And when we think about road mortality in terms of wildlife, I guess we often think about foxes, badgers and deer, the big animals that we quite often see by the side of the road, but we don't often think of other things like toads and small reptiles and that sort of thing, and how many of those are killed on the road every year, because basically we've just fragmented this habitat in so many ways. I mean, can you think, how many places in Britain, for example, would be a kilometre from a road? Not many. And you take out the Scottish Highlands from that, for example, and I bet there's a surprisingly small acreage, that's not within at least a kilometre of a road. And that's, how far is there data on how far toads will travel from,
so
wintering grounds?
They have been known to travel up to 20 kilometres away from their breeding pond, although generally they're going between 1 to 3 kilometres. But actually, another way you can mitigate against that, which is something in our urban area sort of project, we try our best to improve the terrestrial habitat, because if they've got everything they do need for the rest of the year very, very close to the pond, we are essentially trying to stop them doing that big migration, because here, exactly as you're saying, it'd be pretty hard pressed from where I live to go, God, but it'd be lucky if I can get, from where I am right now, definitely surrounded on all sides within a few hundred meters of roads. So it'd be near impossible for a small animal.
Yeah, tell me a bit more about that. You again, when we were chatting off air, you were sort of talking about some of the more urban sites, in particular in London.
Yep.
And why don't you sort of repeat that,
Mhm.
discussion that we had, because I found that fascinating too.
Yeah, it's almost surprising sometimes when you think about particularly toads that are very set in their ways of where they want to go to specific ponds, and that they are still here even whilst we have fragmented our landscape pretty heavily. The more and more urban you do get, but we're finding even in sort of zone 2 of London, you're still finding parks that have populations of toads. And we've still got a few toad patrol groups there that go out and have to tend with double-decker buses and things like that
I was going to
to
say
get
they
them
must take
across.
their lives in their hands doing that. I
Yeah,
mean, it's bad
yeah,
enough in a country village.
yeah. There is a level of safety has to come into it. I
Yeah.
think I said with you, we ideally, of course, love all the toads to get across the road safely, but we don't want any patrollers getting hit by anything. But it is
Well,
fascinating. They are here,
exactly.
and we have a few proactive areas. We have one council in particular that just closes the road. They've identified that this is something very special they have, and they have about 3 or 4 thousand toads a year that move across their lane, and they just decided for a month a year
That's
it's actually
incredible.
not that hard to just close
Yeah.
it and divert traffic, which is
And
wonderful.
how do these populations survive that? When you think about London and the volume of traffic, and it's bad enough, as I said, in the village here, but how on earth do these things survive? I mean, I guess because the thing is that traffic will be going 24/7. It's not like,
Yeah.
in a country village, you get to about 8 or 9 o'clock and the traffic is so light that it has very little impact. But in London, even at 4 o'clock in the morning,
Yeah.
it's going to be relatively busy,
It's that,
or
and
comparatively so.
it's how they're finding that space, which is why I'm a massive champion for things like allotments and people keeping wild spaces in gardens.
Mm,
Because if you've got those places adjacent to some of the parks with the big ponds that toads particularly are using, they won't be travelling the same distance you might find in and around a village where they've got quite a lot of space that they can expand out into
yeah.
if they did wish to. Whereas here we find our populations are more sort of tight knit. They're not going to be travelling quite as far, but it is always fascinating. I think it's something lovely as well to get out and speak to people about, because they
Mm.
don't realise that they're here. Because you might only see them in the evenings or at this time of year, and it's not everybody's cup of tea to go out when it's slightly rainy and cold.
No.
I always say that my colleagues that deal primarily with the reptiles have the right idea. They're out only when
In
it's
the sunny
sunny
weather,
and it's
yeah.
warm, whereas I'm the other way around.
Yeah, you're out at night it's chucking it down with rain, it's freezing cold. Yeah, sometimes it's not very pleasant.
Yeah.
But another surprising thing I think about toads, and a fact that I found out sort of, well, not relatively recently, but not that long ago, is how long lived they can be.
Mhm.
Am I right in saying that they've been recorded up to, say, 25? Is it 25 years of
Oh, you're
age?
higher than that. 30 to
Wow.
35 they have been recorded up to. I mean, the average toad in the wild is more likely to get to about 12, 13, but it's still a good old age.
But
Yeah,
even that, I think,
yeah,
to most people, including me, is
yeah,
surprising,
it
because it's
is.
such a small animal, and such a fragile
Mhm.
animal, that lifespan,
Mhm.
it's mind-boggling.
It is. It's certainly it's comparable, obviously, to having a domestic cat or a dog at home,
Exactly,
and
yeah.
you're thinking the same kind of lifespan for something so tiny. Using that space, it is wonderful.
Yeah, and you think, if you had a female, is it females that tend to live longer than males, or is there
It's
is there
about
no
the same.
difference?
There doesn't
Yeah,
really seem to be much difference with that.
yeah, because if you think about a female that, let's say, lives for 15 or 20
Mhm.
years, how the reproduction cycle of that
Mhm.
animal can contribute to the population every year is
Yeah.
incredible. But that animal gets lost, and that, I have got some graphic images, I will warn people, coming up. It's actually of a frog rather than a toad. But if you lose what we call a gravid female, i.e., a female carrying eggs, that's a whole generation of toads
Mm.
lost in a split second on the road.
Mm.
And it's not only that year, it's
Yeah.
future years. That's why I say to people that it's always sad to see the males getting run over as well. But I always tend to think that actually the females are more important, because you don't need as many males to maintain the population.
Mm.
It's the females you need. So I always get really upset when I get an amplexus pair that might get squashed, or a gravid female. That's the most upsetting thing for me.
I think you're super right with that. I mean, there's obviously a lot on them to make sure they are getting there and laying that spawn, and you also find that if you have very mild winters, and let's say they don't hibernate per se, they'll get up if it's warm, and they have a period of time where they're awake too early, they're using up all of those kind of energy stores. If they're not in breeding condition, they won't go back to that pond at all to breed, whereas the males are going to go no matter what. And you can get some females in some populations, they may only breed every other year if they're not finding they're getting themselves into that. So the minute you start to find deaths of females, it is quite significant.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're spot on.
Oh, there you go. This is, I'll tell you, Emily, this is a bit of a tradition for these. Like I always get one of these at some point. Thank you. Yes, as I said, it's become a bit of a tradition. People that watch this know this. So anyway, thank you for coming on, and cheers, everybody.
I've only got half a cup of tea.
Well, I finished my tea a long time ago. Anyway, where were we? before
you were
booze
talking
arrived.
about the potential sort of disturbing images you might have.
Yeah, so I think it's next. Why don't we share that? And this is the sort of thing that we're trying to stop with Toad Patrol. And we let's go on and let's talk about other things other than Toad Patrol. I think perhaps after this, but this is one of the sort of upsetting things. I mean, this is a male, and that's sad enough to see. But I would rather see a male than a female. Simply, going back to the discussion we were just having, and those reasons, I don't want to see any deaths on the road. It's really quite upsetting. But this is what we come across, and there are some people in the village that help out that just really, they have to leave them, and I have to, I'll go and pick them up because I need to count them. Because as we were saying earlier, this is the reason it's important to count the casualties as well as the live ones, because it's all feeds into that data bank, and then that's when statistics can, you work out population trends and where those populations are going, and it provides really useful data, for Froglife in particular, to look at and try and tease, perhaps how we deal with certain sites and certain populations in other areas. So it's really important, to collect these animals. And I can't remember what we've got in there. Right. Okay. So this is a typical evening, or a busy evening. I mean, we've had, I think I was saying to you before we came on air, we had one night in the village where we collected over 500 in one single evening. It was that sort of perfect storm. It was that perfect mild and wet weather had just come in at the ultimate time for the movement. And I said to everyone, I sent everybody out an email. I said, you come out tonight because it's going to be busy. And my word, it was. I know when it's going to be busy when I have to stop the car and to pick up toads, because I'm forever putting my hazards on and stopping the traffic, picking up toads off the road because I take the car out because I've got all the signs in the back of the car to put up to warn people the Toad Patrol's out. Otherwise I wouldn't take it. And I've got all the buckets, of course. So I keep stopping the car and picking them up. And that night it took me about 15 minutes to drive about a quarter of a mile, because it was just so busy. And we had over 500. I mean, we had so many, we had to stop in the middle of the evening, count them up. So we had the free buckets again, because they were just full, and these things were getting very uncomfortable in the buckets. But 500 animals in a night. But this is a typical evening, and how many out of that group of animals wouldn't have made it? It's difficult to know, but a fair few, I would say, a fair few. And this is the other thing we were going to talk about is signage as well, and how I found it relatively straightforward to get signage put up by the Highways Authority. I just put in a request, and within probably 2 months they were up. So it was fairly straightforward. It's not so for hedgehogs, though, I understand. I don't know whether you know this.
Yeah. So there is a difference with that, and why this has a certain precedence of going up, and it's quite morbid, but being an amphibian with a very sort of damp skin overall, it's if there was a mass movement of toads crossing a road and they all got squashed, it becomes a skid risk.
Yeah.
So for the Highways Agency, it's more of a priority signage-wise versus other animals that are less likely to have the same impact on stopping distances.
Because there's an irony to this, which I find quite frustrating, is probably the politest way of saying it, in the fact that it's not, these signs don't exist for the toads.
Mm-hmm.
They exist because it becomes a risk to human life. And that's why you don't see so many hedgehog signs, for that very reason that you've just explained.
Yeah.
And that we have a healthy it was a healthy population of hedgehogs in the village. And of course, every year, I mean, I get up to 4 in the garden sometimes, and I love seeing them. And that's another species that is massively under pressure in terms of its numbers. But the reason that we can't get signs up in the village and elsewhere across the country is that very fact. And it's so frustrating. It really is. Anyway, so it's not for the animals. It's to protect human life is the reason you get these, which I can see the sense in, but it's also
it's sad that it takes that.
Yeah, to actually get a warning sign put up. It's a bit like deer, isn't it? Because there is a risk of death with deer because they're such a large animal, particularly the males, with their large antlers. So, and the next picture I took with my phone. So this was the other night, and this is the point I was making about females. And this is a frog rather than a toad. But you can see the problem. We've lost the frog, but we've lost the next generation, which is all over the road, as you can see. That frog just, it won't, it has no chance of breeding again. That's it. How many more? I mean, out of interest, do you know the lifespan of a frog?
Lifespan of frogs roughly the same, although they tend to, the up end of it though, frogs again go into about 10 to 12 on average, but that's pretty much their up end. Whereas if the toad was not impacted by us, could make it much older. I sometimes call it the live fast, die young, because they're a faster moving animal, whereas the toad with a much slower pace could make it older. So a little bit of separation.
I remember that. Live fast, die young, yeah. I mentioned that to my
many odd phrases with our amphibians.
No, I like that. So I know it's a bit of a graphic image, but it's I think it demonstrates the problem, and I'm not saying, and I don't think you are, that road crossings are the reason for the declines in these populations, or the sole reason for the declines in these populations, because it's not. It's habitat loss is probably the major driving factor here, but it doesn't help, does it?
Yeah, definitely.
It doesn't help. So I will get that off the screen for people because it's not nice to look at, and I think that is the last slide. But we'll end with it. It's not a toad; it's a frog. But we'll end with a frog that was taken in my garden a year or two ago. No, there was something else I was going to ask you, and I can't remember what it is now. I know I was going to ask you about lifespan. But no, I can't remember what I was gonna ask you. That's frustrating because there was a question in my brain, but anyway. So why the common toad over everything else?
For me specifically, well, not only do I tend to call them colloquially the James Bond of the pond. They have those beautiful sort of golden eyes with the horizontal pupils, and I really appreciate their sort of slower lifestyle. I think they're an incredibly accessible amphibian, with the simple fact of course, if you disturb it, it stays there and it looks back at you, which I think is a fantastic teaching point for many young people as well, to see them and appreciate them. There's many other things, but another one I quite enjoy with them is I like how lazy they are as predators. I really enjoy visiting allotments where they have loads and loads of small satellite ponds to try and encourage the amphibians around. But if your plot has many slugs and snails right next to that pond, that toad is not going to bother going another meter. It will stay there and spend all of its time eating any of those pests immediately in front of it. And I think it really resonates with me, and I think it's quite sweet animal.
My dog's just turned up, so she's wanting a fuss. This tends to happen as well, I'm afraid. No, what I was going to ask you just came back to me, and now it's gone again because Sky's come in and no, sorry, it's gone out of my head again. No, I tell you what it was. Somebody asked me the other day, why are we doing this? Why are we saving the toad? What's so important about the toad? And we sort of had a quick chat about this earlier off air, but one or two of those reasons I think you've just mentioned actually in what you've just been saying about what they feed on. But what is so important about the common toad that we should be worried about this population crash?
Well, not least, I suppose, that it's an animal in our landscape that's been here a very long time, and our sort of Anthropocene itself shouldn't be negatively damaging its habitat whilst we expand, would be one wonderful thing. Of course, we need it generally for food chains. So it is the natural prey of many things. So I think even crows or herons you'll see consuming toads, and they need it for that next step. And actually, even through to some of our reptiles with that. Of course, grass snakes you'll find eating all of our amphibians. They need to be present, these amphibians, for those species also to thrive. And for when it comes to pests, I mean, we don't need the sheer amount of chemicals that we tend to be shifting towards using now, where actually if we had a nice sustained population of amphibians, that would do the job and is far healthier for all of us. And almost like the story of the canary in the mines, that amphibians are so important for us locally to basically check water quality, because if there's something really wrong with that water body, they'll be the first either to die off en masse or to move away from it, and there's something happening. And particularly, again, going back to being in an urban area, we get all kinds of weird and wonderful things occur in our public spaces, and sometimes the only ways you find out that stuff's being dumped into sort of riverways or drainage channels is because the amphibians have indicated something's amiss. So they're incredibly important for us to have.
Well, I mean, it's just I just think any element to an established ecosystem is important. And it's almost that question why it is irrelevant. You just know that if you remove a cog from a machine, don't expect the machine to work as well as it did before. It doesn't matter that you don't know what that cog actually does and why it's there in lots of ways, because it's just makes the whole thing work. And the more we tinker with those parts of the engine, the performance, don't expect the same performance effectively. But I just find them in particular, a fascinating animal. And I know that a lot of people that have come out on Toad Patrol have just developed this love, for this animal. And it's just such a lovely thing to see. And the other thing about the patrol and the group, it's getting people together, people in the village. It's got this village sort of community feeling, and when you get people together like that, and you can actually do a lot of good, and you can make changes. Things do change. Not only are we talking about toads, but we're talking about their habitats. It's cutting road verges less, for example. It's persuading. What I found is that these people that come out are people that are involved with the parish council, so they have local political influence. Because money isn't the answer to everything, and if you can persuade these people that these things are worth saving, then it's amazing what other things actually happen. And a lot of the same people are rewilding parts of their gardens, are thinking about ponds, are thinking about leaving things a little untidy perhaps for hibernation sites for these animals, so they don't actually have to go so far and find a suitable hibernation site. So, there are so many positives. Anyway, we've got a comment, and Susie Crow, hi Susie, says fascinating as always. Well, this is what as Susie will know, because she joined, she joins these lives quite regularly. This is what wild art is all about, and a wild vision is all about. It's not just about the photography and the competition. It's about sharing wildlife facts with everybody and having a discussion and involving people, and trying to inform them, and and teach them something that they didn't know, and engage with them. And the more that the YouTube channel grows, the more of these things we can do. So it reminds me, if you haven't subscribed, do subscribe, and hit the bell icon, which will give you notifications of things as they come up, other events as they come up, and give us a thumbs up. That always helps, and put some comments in the comments below if you're catching up with this on a recording, because all those things help YouTube find us and broadcast us to other people. So that helps the channel grow, and that'll help me bring more of these sorts of things to you. So do that if you can. Emily, what would be give us 2 or 3 sort of facts about, just to finish up, about toads that perhaps I or other people wouldn't know, because
All right.
I threw that one up. Emily didn't know I was going to do this.
So one thing is that, and to be fair, this is also applicable to frogs. So one thing is what they're using their eyes for. So there's a few important things with toads and frogs' eyes. Is this photo is actually lovely to have on the background of the frog to showcase this. Not only is that eye useful for, of course, seeing above the surface of pond water for any predators coming from above, but they're also using their eyes to help them swallow any food. So if you see frogs or toads next to, anywhere really where they may have just eaten something, if you see them repetitively blinking over and over, what's actually happening is the bottom of their eyes is going down into the sort of the roof of their mouth and pushing anything held there down into their stomachs. So it's quite a cool thing there, and I always think that might come up in a pub quiz one day, and hopefully I'm telling everybody the answer to that. It's certainly something very interesting. And that also comes back to, I'm sure, 7:30. Most people's probably had dinner at this point. That also comes back to, if they eat something that is distasteful or makes them have sort of an upset stomach or anyway, they're unable to throw up like we are. So they have their vocal sac underneath their chin, as opposed to us, which we have our muscles here. So quite often you'll find them using their front arms or front hands, and they'll reach into their mouths to pull anything out that they've just swallowed that now hasn't settled to them. And there's a few other species elsewhere in the world which you'll spot that do this even more extreme. But yeah, I'll let you Google that afterwards to find out. And then another good fact about them is actually when you see lots of Shakespeare's writing about amphibians and particularly toads, often what was written then was many companies, even Coca-Cola, very, very early on in their time, would want to hide their recipes of what was going into any kind of potions or any kind of foodstuffs. So they used to choose amphibians, and particularly toads, as an undesirable, it's a toad's warts or whatever is in this, to protect their recipes, whereas actually it's more likely it was something like wheat or a plant that they've grown. So they used to use it to mask any ingredients. So that's sort of a few of their things, really.
Yeah, didn't do much to enhance the toad's reputation, Shakespeare, did he? Really?
No. He could have had a better PR package for them.
Yeah, that's half the trouble, isn't it? It is. But I think what Froglife does, and why don't you just talk briefly about the work of Froglife and why it's such an important organization. It's an organization which I've known for quite a while, and I really, I really admire the work that it does on such a small budget. I would assume, because these organizations rely on donations, don't they? I mean, there's nothing else funding this, and they do such amazing work. So give them a plug and let everybody know, exactly what the organization does.
Oh, perfect. So we are a national wildlife conservation charity conserving amphibians and reptiles in their habitats. And one of the key things that we're trying our best to do is working in 3 different ways. So the first one is transforming lives. So a key thing in our ethos is to not exclude anyone from conservation. It's not just for certain people, and it's not just for certain places. So we try our best to reach as many different people as possible, and also different ages or any places where you might find people. So we've worked even within prisons and on prison land, because there's lots of land there. You can do a lot of work in reform, in creating ponds, particularly in that kind of space that these big organisations have. We work a lot within schools. I mentioned, of course, the virtual reality and trying to engage a different audience to think a little bit more about these animals. As I said, they're not necessarily the ones we hear a lot about or know a lot about publicly. Another big area of our work is, of course, the landscape stuff. So that's focusing any grant money or donations that we do get into areas that do need help. So whether that's declining amphibian and reptile populations or populations that just need a little bit more help. And actually that's where toads on roads and the patrollers generally create such value for us. So for my project here in London, there is a limited budget within the grant itself. So thank you if any of you do play the National Lottery. You've made that possible. Yeah. But the key thing there was we have 14 main sites that we're working on for toads, and those were identified by local people that know where toads are, and they know colloquially or anything written in local history that there used to be more and there's a problem occurring. So it really makes us and helps us to focus where we should be working. So very much so thank you to all of you that go out and do that. And then the sort of final area of our work is research. And that's something you don't hear as much from us. It sort of happens in the background. It isn't as public facing. And we work with sort of international partners looking into wildlife health. So that's a massive, massive area for us. Sadly, the amphibians and reptiles are suffering quite a lot from a few different diseases. And it's something we're actively monitoring in the UK with our partners, Garden Wildlife Health. And something I alluded to a little bit earlier on, which has been another big key focus for us, is wildlife tunnels. So we do a lot of work looking into what is the correct sizing and shaping and what's appropriate management and the creation of these, and how highways agencies and developers in the future, well, should be putting them in, but how's best and what's the best way of doing it. So I suppose in a nutshell, that's kind of what we do in that sense, and just try and access as many people as possible, really, to think a little bit more. So it's wonderful to have been invited to talk on here, Rob, with you.
No, so it's a pleasure. This is what I really like about Froglife as an organisation. It's an organisation that involves people. It from in different ways. Everybody from the people that come out on my toad patrol, for example, through to international organisations. But it's making conservation accessible to people, and I think that spreads a message. And it changes attitudes in people, and that is very, very powerful. If you change attitudes collectively in a group of people, and you do this repeatedly in different areas of the country, it's a very, very powerful thing, because people that have the ability and have the money to affect change in a positive way, it's just a very, very important thing, and we can affect change very, very quickly that way. So thank you and Froglife for all the amazing work you do, and it was an absolute pleasure to support you with that category last year from Wild Art. I must talk to Victoria and see who she wants to support again this year. It may well be Froglife again. It's something close to her heart. Hey, we've got a couple of comments just coming in. So Alan James says, thanks, Rob and Emily. Very interesting and entertaining. Absolute pleasure, Alan. As I said, this is what we're here to do. Susie Crow says, I love to photograph frogs and toads and dragonflies, and it's so nice to find out more about the story behind my subjects. Keep these coming. Well, do you know, that's talking about Victoria. Victoria's a scientist, and she developed the other way around in terms of the photography. The photography was a byproduct almost of her scientific interests. So Susie, you're perhaps the other way around and have been photographing these animals and now want to learn a bit more. But isn't it fascinating? And I think, once you, as a photographer myself, when you understand more about these animals and their behaviors, I think they bore into your soul a bit more, and it changes the way you look at them, and it changes the work you do. and the output, the images that come out of your camera are different because you have a connection. You get this connection with your subject. And I think if we're going to talk photography, that to me is a big part of being able to produce exceptional work, and work that's a bit different is having knowledge of your deep-seated knowledge of your subject. So for all the photographers out there.
I think yeah, you've hit the nail on the head there again, because that's something I tried to build into London T.O.A.D project overall. We ran photography workshops to get people that have that kind of eye as an amazing way for people to connect. And everybody nowadays walks around with cameras on their phones, and it's such an easy way to get a bit closer to that nature, even if it is just taking photos for things like Instagram. It's incredible, different people's perspectives. And actually we did a drawing class, drawing amphibians, and even for me, who's been doing this for years, it was absolutely fascinating seeing someone who's far more creatively minded than me explain how you would draw a toad versus a frog, for instance. And it was lovely to basically notice that everything I know from a sort of biological perspective of how their body is shaped, she knew purely from looking at the shape of the animal. And it was just lovely to see that you get that when you merge the arts.
Exactly. And I think as photographers, we have a very, very important role to play here. And I've said this, a few times in some of these lives that I've done, that, we are bringing these things alive to people that perhaps don't have regular contact with them. And that's a really important aspect to all this. If people, you take the extreme and you take David Attenborough's wonderful programs, but that's based on fabulous photography, and that's only improved as the technology's gone on and the years have advanced. But that's actually, it's getting people to care about things that they don't necessarily have regular contact with, because they see the photographs out there regularly. They're in regular it brings things into people's living rooms, into people's onto people's phones, because I mean, let's face it, we're in an Instagram age pretty much. But it brings these things alive for people, and if you do that, then you've got a better chance of persuading them to care about them. And if they care about them, they'll care about wanting to protect them. And so we have a very, very important role. And if you can make these things, not that they aren't beautiful in themselves, but if you can portray them in that way, if you can portray them in their habitats in the most beautiful way, in an artful way, then that's very, very powerful, I think. You see, the photographer in me is coming out now. Anyway, a couple more comments. Susie Crow says, been very lucky to photograph with Victoria Hillman, such a lovely lady and a big influence on my photography. Mine too, Susie, actually. I have to say, Vic's been a very good friend over the last few years. So, since I met her through another photography competition that I ran. She only lives about an hour away from me. So we meet up regularly, but she's had a very, very big influence on my photography and the way my style has changed. A very talented lady. Not only can she photograph things well, she can draw as well. And Sue Dawes says, here. And Alan James says, Vic's now drawing them too. Yes, she is. And as I said, she's a very, very good artist too. So and she does. Oh, sorry, my Sky's barking. Sorry about that. She's getting bored. Anyway, Emily, it's been absolutely brilliant to talk. Yeah, thank you. I think the door's closed on her. That's the trouble. Bear with me just a second while I open the door, and we'll.
No problem.
Go on, out you go. That's dealt with that. Sorry about that. It's been lovely talking to you, Emily, and thank you so much for coming on and sharing all these sort of lovely facts and sharing the love for our amphibians. Obviously that we both share. So it's been brilliant. So thank you so much. And let's do it again sometime. Because,
yes, definitely.
We perhaps we can talk about newts or
yeah. Or I'm up for any of them. We've got 13 native species. We could do all of them.
So why don't we cover some of the other amphibians, because obviously we've concentrated on primarily toads and mentioned frogs, but as you say, there are so many other species out there that we could talk about, and actually might be really interesting for people because they might not know too much about them. So yeah, so why don't we do that? So anyway, thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming on. So thank you everybody for watching. Let me just bring up an outro video. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed that. It was certainly very informative. I learned a few things. So I'm not sure when the next live will be. It will probably be the announcement of the winners for our wet category. So look out for that, but look out for the notifications. There are a couple of photographer interviews already lined up, as well, as you'll see if you look at the YouTube channel. So look out for those if photography is your thing. But thanks very much for watching. Emily, stay on the line a second. We'll have a quick chat afterwards. But thank you all for watching, and we'll see you again next time.